Foucault himself said that Western secular democracy was the most barbaric and oppressive system the world had ever known.
Welcome to Deprogrammed on Unsafe Space. My name is Carter Laren, and I'm joined, as always, by the bad mamma jamma, Keri Smith.
Hi, Carter.
Hey, Keri. Both of us are very excited today to have a special guest.
Yeah, I'm gonna try not to fangirl too much, but I'm so excited that she's joining us. I'm gonna let you do the fancy intro, and then I can.
Okay, good. With us, we have today Helen Pluckrose. Helen is the editor of Areo Magazine, a broadly liberal and humanist digital magazine which looks at culture, politics, science, and art. She's best known for her essays on social justice scholarship and activism, and for her work on the Grievance Studies Project, which, if you haven't seen, by the way, you should totally go check out Dog Sect in the Park and other things. Her upcoming book with James Lindsay, Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody, is out next year. You can follow her on Twitter at @Pluckrose, and I'll also put links to her Areo page and her upcoming book on Amazon in the show notes below so you can see that. So, Helen, welcome to Deprogrammed on Unsafe Space. Thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Before we get, I was just talking to Keri about this beforehand. You have probably the deepest and most nuanced understanding of social justice and the movement and the philosophy behind it of like anyone that I've seen think or write about this. So I think we could get pretty deep into this. But before we do, can you give people an idea of who you are, why you're talking about social justice? You describe yourself as in exile from humanities. You were focused on late medieval, early modern religious writing by and about women, and now you're doing this. So why, I guess, is the just to introduce yourself to our audience.
Well, I'm largely an empiricist and a universal liberal. So I'm very concerned that knowledge claims are evidenced and that our principles are consistent for everyone. That is who I am ethically. It was who I was as a feminist, as a critic of religion, and now as a critic of the social justice scholarship and activism. So I have done undergraduate and postgraduate studies in literature, and it was extremely difficult to look at writing by women or for women without using a particular feminist lens. So I found that extremely frustrating. And at the same time as this was happening, my role within liberal feminism, I've been a feminist forever, was becoming harder and harder due to the rise of these really postmodern ideas about power and privilege. And so it all kind of came to a head. I was with James and Peter, we were mostly criticizing religion, and because of where we are geographically, it was mostly Christianity, and we were criticizing it for its unevidenced truth claims and its illiberal values. Then when this social justice movement really started gaining speed from about 2015, it was very hard for us not to notice that this is exactly the same kind of problem. It's a problem with knowledge, it's a problem with ethics again. And so we've been addressing that quite consistently ever since.
So I had one of the first, I was trying to remember how I first met you online, but I think one of the first pieces I read that really stuck with me, and I've used it over and over because it helps me explain social justice and how it's different from liberalism, was your piece, No Liberal Lefties Are Not Right Wing. So I send that to people all the time because I don't know how much you know about this program, but Deprogrammed is a little bit about the social justice ideology, and specifically I was in it for like 20 years. But a lot of times I don't have or I'm searching for the right language to help other people understand it. And so that piece of yours was excellent because you broke it down into radical left, liberal left, and identitarian left. And I was wondering if you could just briefly explain your view of what are those different categories?
Yeah, certainly. Of course, I should do the disclaimer first to say that it doesn't really break down quite as easily, but these are the three main currents with some overlap and variation. So when we're talking about we'll talk about the radical left first. This is the one that comes from the Marxist understanding. It sees society as oppressed and oppressor classes. It looks very specifically at economics and at social class. When it goes into feminism, it tends to treat men and women as oppressor and oppressed classes in the same way. It sees women as having been socialized into domestic roles in order to support to make workers for a capitalist system. So radical feminists believe gender is completely a cultural construct, so they don't accept trans identity. The Marxists generally believe in objective truth. They believe in evidence and reason. They're not terribly keen on all this identity stuff, but they also think that that liberalism with the freedom of markets and the freedom of individuals is largely a myth. So then we have the liberal left, and they tend to be, they're economically, socially democrats. So they want to tax the richest most. They want nationalised healthcare. They want a strong safety net, but they're very much about freedom of the individual. So they will support a regulated capitalist system. They are open. They want freedom of speech. They believe in the marketplace of ideas. They think this is how good ideas survive and bad ones die. And then we have the social justice or identitarian left, which has come out of a strange mix of both the radical and the liberal, and they see society as structured of systems of power and privilege which are invisible to most people. So it lies just beneath the surface. Now that we've sorted out the laws, it's illegal to discriminate against women or people of colour, and it's male homosexuality is legal, same-sex marriage. There's few legal battles to fight now, if any. So it's all about discourses, biases, and attitudes. And their job is to discover these beneath the surface of what seems like a nice liberal society, draw it to everyone's attention, and have it dealt with or punished. Sometimes I think the best way to understand the difference between them is by understanding how they see power. So for Marxists or materialists, power is something that presses down. The rich oppress the poor quite knowingly, and the poor may not be aware of what's happening. For the social justice or identitarian left, power works through discourses, ways of talking about things. So certain understandings of society will become established as knowledge, and then everyone will repeat it. So power sort of circulates through society, through the speech of everyone who is not woke to it. For liberals, power is something which people can have and they can abuse. It's either an individual decision to abuse power and oppress people, or it's the operation of dominant groups in society, but everybody knows what they're doing. For the social justice people, they don't think that we know what we are oppressing. We're so socialized into it that we're just reciting what's been written on us.
And this is man, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
You've mentioned, I mean, you have a really interesting article called What Social Justice Gets Right. And in that article, you mentioned that there's a tendency to want to reject everything that the social justice movement claims is quote, problematic outright, when in fact, it's not necessarily all completely wrong. It's the approach or the conclusions that they draw are wrong. And one of the things that you just made me think about was this idea that I think you write, let's see, they do well when they advise us to be introspective about this, so that you're talking about biases that we might have, and examine our own thought process honestly. And then you write, unfortunately, this is often not what they advise. So you talk about, it's really almost, rather than saying, hey, we might have these biases, let's be introspective about it, they're looking at this from we're going to almost make a moral judgment against you and look at everyone else and assume we know what's going on in their minds about why they're doing this stuff. Is that correct? It's a nuance, but I want to understand it.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. It's a lot like priests taking confession, deciding what is a sin and what isn't, and what should be done about it. But in this case, the individual doesn't have to confess anything. They are racist just because they're white. They are sexist just because they're male. And because we have this very postmodern Derridean idea that the intention of speech is no more authoritative than the impact of it, someone can tell somebody else what they meant, what discourse they are speaking into. So you might say something which you didn't think was racist, you had no thought of race in your mind, but if somebody else experiences it as racist, then you have to acknowledge the reality of that and apologize and try to do better.
It seems almost like metaphysically contradictory, though, to have this, like, there's no objective knowledge that we're trying to obtain, but I have objective knowledge that what you just did is bad because someone was offended.
So we call the latest, the last years, reified postmodernism, because it has now decided it has the objective truth, which is that everything is culturally constructed in these systems of power and privilege. So the first postmodernists couldn't have said that their reading of somebody else's words was the authoritative one, but the people that we have now can, and they do.
I have a question for you about people who are identitarians or do subscribe to these what I call SJW beliefs. When I was an SJW, I've tried to explain this to Carver before, I didn't realize I was an identitarian leftist. I thought I was a progressive. I thought I had like words that I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about. And now that I have been trying to untangle this for a few years, when I talk to people who are clearly in it, and they're coming at me and trying to tell me this is the new definition of racism, or this is the new definition of sexism, and they're telling me the same things I preached for so long. How do you, I guess my question is, how would you suggest helping people to see that their beliefs are not something that are magically in just poof that are in their head, that it comes from, that there's a word for it? Like when I talk about postmodernism or Marxism, their eyes glaze over, and a lot of times they've never even heard of postmodernism. So it's like they can't. How do you help people see that their ideas come from a place and that they have a history, and that they it's not necessarily they're not necessarily using the right labels for what they believe?
I think this is on one level. I think when we're addressing this, most of the time we're talking to people who aren't quite there yet, who have sympathies there, who are leaning that way, but are still open to universally, consistently liberal approaches. Then you can speak to them about the differences here. But when you've got somebody who is really, really deeply embedded in it, I don't think there is any one way fits all answer to this. If you know somebody, I recently, last year, I started a conversation with someone who was very deeply embedded in it, but he was willing to believe that I meant well. And so we made some progress. He made some suggestions to me that of problems with my liberalism. I spoke to him, and it went back and forth for a while, but in the end, unfortunately, he was shamed for having anything to do with me and decided he couldn't speak to me anymore.
Of course.
But, yeah. But,
that's awful.
Yeah, so I think there is, but unless somebody is open, I don't see much hope of getting through to those who are really buried in that system. You couldn't convince someone like Robin DiAngelo that she is wrong, or that there are other ways to look at things. She's so deeply embedded in her system. I think we have to change society. We have to draw more people away from it and not have this prestige for these ideas, so that there is less incentive to throw yourself in and get completely embedded in that kind of mentality in the first place.
It's difficult because they seem to reject the classically liberal idea that the marketplace of ideas is a valuable commodity, and that we should be exchanging ideas and fighting bad ideas openly with discourse. They seem to just want to shut down conversation.
Yeah, that comes again from the understanding of how society is constructed by discourses. So if you really believe that what society is running on is dominant discourses that get reinforced by being spoken, you're not going to want them to be spoken. You're not going to see that you're going into a conversation where two ideas are doing battle on a level playing ground. That isn't possible. They'll just see somebody enforcing a dominant narrative and somebody trying to speak against it, but ultimately failing because society is against them and with the dominant one. So they really see it as dangerous to platform or discuss with anybody who holds ideas that they consider to do harm to marginalized people.
Epistemologically, that just seems so nakedly wrong that it's hard to understand how anyone could hold that. Do they not understand their own? I mean, am I wrong? Do they not understand their own kind of rejection of reason and evidence and valid, what I'll call scientific epistemology?
That they understand it and they justify it, and this mostly traces back to Foucault. So I mean, if we think how it's perfectly right for the queer theorists, for Judith Butler, for Foucault to say what was understood about homosexuality has changed incredibly quickly. 100 years ago, it was still largely seen as a behavior that was sinful, but medicalization was starting to happen. By the 50s and 60s, it was seen as a disorder that was shameful. From about the 70s onwards, it's been some people are gay, get over it. So that's a really rapid change of dominant narratives. So is homosexuality evil, disordered, or neutral? That's happened so far. So you can see how this idea comes that people believe, particularly in science, in scientific narratives, and this is how they then speak to each other about it. And this needs to be unpacked. What they don't actually accept is that it wasn't postmodernism that unpacked and dismantled the idea that homosexuality was a disorder. That was science. That was the marketplace of ideas. That was liberalism. But they tend to think that only this is the worst thing about the sort of postmodern social justice approach, is that they do believe they are the only ones who are woke, that nobody else can actually see that there's a problem. We can't argue ideas out. We have to be told what they are and become woke to the right problems. In reality, over the last 500 years, we've overcome feudalism, theocracy, patriarchy, slavery, colonialism. We've got past all of these, and this was nothing at all to do with postmodernism. This was about being able to discuss ideas, to talk about moral progress, and to actually make that progress.
And specifically, it was about the kind of classical liberal individualism, the idea that each human is valuable as a human on their own, and these other traits aren't relevant morally.
Yeah, and the traditionally sort of broadest philosophically liberal position, and we always get into trouble when we use the word liberal, because in the US that often means left, and then classical liberal sometimes means libertarian. But what I'm talking about is the traditional liberal aim to recognize individuals, to recognize our shared humanity, to open everything up to everyone, and to make society generally more free and more fair.
But they're claiming credit for what that idea has, the progress that idea has made in society. Are you saying that the social justice crowd claims that the improvement in the treatment of homosexuals and minorities and genders is because of social justice, not because of the liberal ideas? They're
often reluctant to concede that any any improvement has actually happened. So it's actually a central tenet of critical race theory that racism has not decreased at all. So that comes up with this interest convergence theory, in which it's quite a paranoid conspiracy theory, in which every time rights have been extended to people of color, this has been because it suited white people. So there's no
I'm sorry. Some of their ideas, I just kind of, that's just, okay. Go ahead.
So, yeah, you know, that doesn't pay any heed to the fact that, I mean, I'm over here in the UK, I think in the 50s, there was something like 80% of people who didn't want someone of a different race living next door. Last year, it was 5%. So there's been such a huge change in racial attitudes.
There's empirical evidence. But they don't.
That means nothing. They think this is why they object to liberalism. Critical race theory does. That's another one of its tenets, is to object to liberalism, because they think it makes an appearance of progress, but any small progress that is made is so slow that it gets swallowed up, and that white people then have some kind of contract to find a way to continue to keep black people down, no matter what happens. So it's. They often don't admit that progress has happened. And within queer theory, then we're constantly moving on to something else, looking at oppressions and, you know, finding them in cis-normative language or whatever, and they're not inclined to see progress. Occasionally, when I speak to an activist, they will tell me that if I don't like identity politics, then I must have been against gay pride and liberal feminism and the civil rights movements. But as I've written and said to them many times, this is a different thing. It does need to be recognised. So generally, we're kind of torn between the claim that what social justice is just a continuation of those civil rights movements, and the claim that there isn't actually progress at all. I mean, Foucault himself said that Western secular democracy was the most barbaric and oppressive system the world had ever known. So,
I don't know if you saw, but we just did an interview with Maria Tuscan, who is this knitter, and I know you interviewed Catherine Jepson Moore, who did this great series for Colette about the social justice wars in knitting, and with the interview with Maria, we got an influx of new viewers who are knitters, and a lot of them have left comments. It's almost like they've been trying to understand what was happening in their little microcosm.
Yeah.
So I know that you have thought a lot about, or you're interested in talking about, like, how social justice ideas move into and take over an enclosed space. And given that we have some of these new viewers, if you were to try and explain what happened in their community to them, how would you do that? Like, how does these ideas spread?
Yeah, I was just recently looking at Maria, was it Tuscan? And she of the shiny white face, as somebody said, didn't they? And that seemed to be, yeah. And she was urging charity, kindness, and reason, essentially, wasn't she? And this has been seen as racist, as whiteness, and this is to do with the belief that whiteness is a kind of system which tries to look nice, but is actually very oppressive. It hides everything under the surface, but if you dig deep enough, you can find it. And so when poor Maria stuck her head up above and said, I think this is going a bit nuts now, then she became the problem. And this is, and I used to say that I thought social justice ideas, postmodern ideas, would burn themselves out fairly quickly because they are so contradictory. They're not like Marxism, which can hold one truth and become totalitarian. That it's too fragmented and different. But I think we're starting to see now that when social justice ideas get a hold within a closed environment, they can go very nasty very quickly. And so I'm looking back, we've got enough examples of this now. I think that the kind of introductions to it was with the Gamergate stuff, and then the new atheists. So with the Gamergate, we had like two completely opposing narratives just bashing at each other, and it was very confusing to anybody outside of the system. I saw that this was going on and that it was extremely uncharitable, but I didn't follow it very well. And then it hit my movement, so it caused a huge schism in the New Atheists, because there had been two groups, really. There was one group who were liberals and who were empiricists. We wanted to know what was true, and we wanted things to be fair for everybody. And then there was another group of atheists who were very much focused on the social justice issues, women's rights, LGBT rights. They weren't so keen on what was true, and this caused a huge schism, which essentially broke up the atheist movement. And I'm not altogether sad about that. I think it had its day. I don't want to define myself by something I'm not for the rest of my life, but it did destroy it. But then when we're seeing things that actually, when it's taken hold of universities, I don't know if you've seen the videos by my colleague, collaborator, Mike Nayna, on Evergreen University. Mm-hmm. What happened there, and he with Benjamin Boyce have made some wonderful videos which really show how this built up. And it was one area of it really took over, and it was the critical race theory. It was the Robin DiAngelo ideas. First of all, there started to be courses on dismantling your whiteness, and there was a lot of talk of this ideology around. And then once the university had said, yes, we do need to dismantle our our whiteness, yes, all white people are racist unconsciously, it had no choice but to go along with this. At one point, the student protesters had actually taken the staff hostage, and the staff had asked the police to step back. They got sort of caught up in this kind of madness that really was very, very dangerous. If any of your viewers want to watch this video, particularly your knitting viewers, they've felt the impact of it through the internet, which is bad enough. But have a look at the video and see how it looks when you're trapped in a room with it. It was like a witch hunt.
I remember the part where they were asking the university president, he was talking to the students, and they were telling him, put your hands down. And he was putting his hands down, and then they were laughing gleefully because it was about exerting that power over him. It was really scary.
Yeah, that's what I think we're seeing as well in the knitting community and in the young adults community. There's this underlying ideology where it is virtuous to problematize, to find evidence of racism or transphobia or something and call it out. That increases your virtue. You also feel as though you're doing something because you know that there is this horrible racist or cisnormative system underlying everything and oppressing people, and you can dig part of it out and make it visible. But at the same time, there is also a real kind of mean girls attitude going on, and boys can be mean too, but it's a real sort of joy in bullying. Once their blood is smelled in the water, the circling is I think it's one of the nastiest aspects of human nature.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, mean girls, because actually, Carter, I've been wanting to bring this up with you. Some of the people in the comments, the knitters, have been asking, kind of circling that question of, I think one of them even said, I can't help but wonder if there were more men in the knitting community if this would have happened. Now, I know lots of men who subscribe to this belief system, and I know men can be mean, but do you think that do you think women are more susceptible to these beliefs?
I do, but I'm not sure how useful that is, because in the same way that men are more prone to physical violence, I think women, when they're the sort of most toxic behavior, which is more common to women, is verbal nastiness. Right. So okay. I think, it doesn't surprise me that there is so much verbal bullying in a social justice community, which is mostly female, because I think that is the nastiest aspect of an unhealthy psyche. But just as the majority of men are not violent, the majority of women are not verbal bullies either. But it's, yeah, it really is. It's something very nasty that now has something virtuous to latch onto.
You point out that Gamergate, though, and that's, I mean, the gaming community is overwhelmingly male, and they still had an issue there, although women were involved in that issue. There was still a lot of that Mean Girls going on. Do you think it seems from the outside, it seems like there's almost I won't say it's intentional, but it seems like there's this divide and conquer strategy where there's a lot of effort put in one specific niche community and a lot of energy. And once they've kind of triumphed there, they can take that energy and move to another community. And the people in that community feel very isolated because there's not a lot of people that rush to their defense because they're relatively unknown. So unless someone happens to write a Quillette series about your community, very few people are there to come in and to rush in to support you. And so it's almost rational that you kind of succumb to the bullying, because otherwise you get completely ostracized.
Yeah, I think this is what we're seeing again. I think this is how communities have policed themselves historically, generally. And as I look at the late medieval period, so I know how this kind of how powerful sort of public shaming and ostracism is, and how important reputation is. Quite often social justice activists say, well, nothing really bad has happened, he's just been criticized. And no, his reputation has been absolutely destroyed. There's really not much that is more destructive than that. But yeah, I mean, with the early signs, and this was before this escalation of social justice ideas. With the Gamergate thing, this was a feminist reaction, and quite a lot of the feminists who were involved in it would now be considered white feminists by the intersectionals. And there's the same kind of group with the new atheists, but I'm starting to see more and more evidence of what can happen when an enclosed system gets infected by it, because I don't think social justice is taking over the world. I think it's something like 8% of people, that hidden tribes, things who actually hold any of these ideas to any degree at all. But when they get social influence and they get power in a community, and particularly when we're looking at the young adult books, we've seen Amelie Zhao, and
you're talking about it infiltrating the young adult novel, like that area.
Yeah, with the problem that we've just seen in the knitting community that Catherine was telling me about. And she was telling me that the names that came up over and over again were D'Angelo and Sard. So this is very much connected to the academic literature. Also, the knitting community has a tendency to be middle-class white women, which is again the sort of center of these kind of social justice ideas. And I think this is the same thing that we've been seeing happening in the young adult books as well, where there's been one Asian woman, one black gay man who have had to withdraw their books because they have been problematized by the community. And it is so dangerous now for anybody to write about identity at all. There's a significant concern that the young adult books are going to become either very anodyne, or publishers just aren't going to be willing to publish anything about identity at all. For artists, particularly, if you do write characters which have a different identity to your own, you're appropriating them. But if you don't, then you're failing to represent.
I noticed that they have a catch-22.
Yes,
you have to write. I saw that it happened when it started to implode in that community. Writers were simultaneously being told your characters are not diverse enough, and then if you did write diverse characters, it's like, well, stay in your lane. That's an expression they like to use. Mm-hmm. You don't know this experience. You can't write to it. So what are you to write about?
Yeah. It's getting harder and harder. As you know, editor of Areo, I'm getting increasing submissions from artists of various kinds saying they just can't create at the moment. Everything they do is problematized, they're restricted, and it's significant that it's this kind of ideology seems to be attacking the academic and the creative world, and this is where social justice ideas have the greatest dominance at the moment. They really are quite a sort of privileged group. So we're not seeing, for example, lots of social justice ideas or protests in community colleges. We're seeing them in the elite Ivy League ones. We're seeing them in groups for people who have time on their hands, who have the money to spend on hobbies, who on literary research. It really is quite an elitist issue.
And you think that's just a function of people with more resources just have more leisure time to sit around and contemplate their navel and white patriarchy and oppression, or is there some other reason why it's the more elite universities?
I think it is I think it is just generally a middle class educated phenomenon. It claims to speak for marginalized groups, including the poorest people, but it doesn't actually seem to do that very much. It seems to be wealthy and successful academics. And Catherine wrote, didn't she, that quite a lot of the people who were causing the problems in the knitting group were academics as well, and were citing academics. So it's not an on the ground problem. It's a middle class privileged issue, I think, and this is the criticism that a lot of the Marxists and socialists make of social justice, that it ends up ignoring class issues and economics and focusing very much on a small subset of society who are already in the sort of upper income bracket and have plenty of time on their hands to talk about attitudes and speech and not actually address social issues very much.
So this reminds me of, I think you wrote an article about cultural Marxism not being a valid concept, or maybe you used the myth.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people, including us, I've used the term before, although I do agree with your distinction. A lot of people look at this and they just see, okay, Marxism is about stratifying people into different groups by class, and this is they just replace the class groups with identity, and that's kind of why
identity and power. That's the way we've described it in the past.
But you have I think a more accurate description of why this cultural Marxism isn't really the right way to describe this, and how it is distinct from Marxism. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, you can't discount Marxism as an influence. It certainly is. Derrida himself, he set this out most explicitly in Spectres of Marx, when he said he wanted to take some of the attitude and the spirit of Marxism and apply it differently. And in that, he also said the one thing that's absolutely certain is that I am not a Marxist. And so the Marxists certainly don't have a great deal of sympathy for the postmodernists, but they are kind of a wellspring for it. When in the late 60s, when a lot of leftist academics became disillusioned with Marxism because of the problems of communism, because it wasn't solving the problems in the way they wanted, postmodernism can largely be understood as a crisis of confidence. It was the idea that Marxism was this big overarching meta-narrative. It was this big explanation that covered so much and was the way to make a better society. And when that had failed, leftist academics were largely left thinking, well, can we trust anything? So the systems that they criticized, the meta-narratives, the grand narratives, were Christianity, Marxism, and science. So postmodernism can be understood as a reaction to Marxism, but it's what's really important to get the idea of is that it's changed its epistemology. Marxists are objectivists. They think they have the answer. They are empiricists. They want to change material reality. Whereas postmodernists don't think there is an objective reality. They want to look at how we're thinking and talking. So this is a very different conception of society. And within academia, there are still materialist scholars and postmodern scholars, and they are very much opposed. I've done an analogy. Some people have said this is useful. If you can think of Marxism as Judaism and postmodernism as Christianity. So in postmodernism, you get some of the elements of Judaism. It's got some of the main features, but the central focus has changed. And that's really important. That's what it's all about now.
I really like that. Yeah. That is very helpful.
Yeah. So, but you don't see Christianity in Judaism. That hasn't adopted any of it. And so that's kind of, when you are speaking to someone who is a pure Marxist, you're not going to see postmodern ideas in there.
So it's an evolution. I mean, how would it relate to the Frankfurt School then? Because in my mind, the evolution would be classical Marxists, then the critical theoreticians in the Frankfurt School, and then evolving into postmodernism after that. Is that the right way to think about it, or is that totally wrong?
Yeah, I think of it less as evolving as steps away from, because there are evolutions of Marxist ideas. There are materialist socialist scholars now, and they're still looking at material reality. They're looking at economics, law, politics, government. So they are the evolution of the Marxists. They're less utopian. They've expanded their views, but they're still very much looking at the structures and material realities. Whereas the postmodernists, the people we see now on the sort of discourse analysts and attitudes, implicit bias, trigger warnings, safe spaces, they are coming from the postmodernists. But you are, yes, absolutely right to see these kind of steps, because there were the Marxists, and then there were the post-Marxists, and the Frankfurt School and the New Left. These are all kind of little steps in slightly different ways away from Marxism, and towards looking more at cultural impacts. So it's.
No, I guess to look, I'm not a philosopher, so I don't have a deep.
Me neither.
To a layperson, it seems like, in the Frankfurt School, you had basically this frustration with the failure of Marx to predict the kind of revolutions that they expected. Yeah. And when the revolution did happen in Russia, it was a totalitarian dictatorship. They had the rise of Nazism, and my understanding was it was like they took kind of the Marxist class struggle and they infused it with like Freud's repression a little bit, and kind of developed, Marcuse kind of developed this critical theory of like, okay, it's the repression that kind of is made worse by capitalism. It's ultimately all kind of this anti-capitalist agenda with, I view it as like philosophy developed as a weapon for the social change that they wanted. And I still see the Frankfurt School as kind of the genesis of this forgetting about Marxist classes economically and moving it into the stepping away into this identity politics on some level. They still had different epistemology than the postmodernists, but that was kind of the introduction of that. Am I wrong about that?
No, absolutely not. I think, yes, you can quite accurately see the Frankfurt School as becoming skeptical of the simplistic, mechanistic aspects of Marxism, but not embracing the postmodernism. For example, Habermas is, as we know, was very critical of postmodernism. So we've got that they're a kind of hybrid that sort of fizzled out. If you think of it as like a family tree of different kinds of humans, the Frankfurt School, it developed a bit towards the postmodern ideas, but it then kind of stopped. People aren't citing, our current suspects aren't citing Marcuse or Adorno, they're not. So, and then with those who called themselves post-Marxists as well, they were in a similar space of becoming disillusioned with the simplicity of Marxism and trying to expand their horizons, but they weren't quite developing any sort of concise theory, any real framework at this point. And then you have the radical new left, which had the really sort of Marxist revolutionary aim, but they're also focusing on identity. So they're kind of like three false starts away from Marxism, but the one that has survived and evolved is the postmodern. So by the time you get to postmodern ideas and where we are now, when we're not considering class or economics at all, this can't really be considered an evolution of Marxism, but rather a sort of shedding of it in stages.
Is it the same to the postmodern? I guess to kind of bring it back to social justice, are the postmodernists kind of motivated by the same, I'll say, anti-Western or anti-capitalist or anti-Western? Is that the same motivation as the earlier schools, or is it a different motivation?
Okay, right. This is a personal hypothesis of mine, but I'm quite confident about it. I think the postmodernists and the Marxists today are essentially different personality types. So when you've got the Marxists or the materialists, they are really interested in figures and measurements of things. They're interested in politics, law, economics, things you can really measure. And so they don't have much patience for this deeply theoretical stuff about discourses and language and power. That's frustrating to them. But those who are within discourse analysis, they don't like to actually get their hands dirty with material reality. And so I myself am very much of this discourse analysis attitudes. How are we speaking about things? How are we imagining things? But I disagree with them. So I don't think they are coming from the same kind of place psychologically. Intellectually, yes, and morally, we've still got this concern for this care harm foundation. Mm-hmm. Jonathan Haidt's work on.
Yeah, but can you explain it a little bit, because it would be helpful, I think, to.
Yeah, so according to Haidt, with his moral foundations, liberals and leftists is what he means mostly by this, are people who are focused on the justice and care harm. So it really is looking out for the more oppressed and the vulnerable in society, whereas conservatives have a fuller range of moral intuitions. So I think it is absolutely fair to say that both the Marxists and the postmodernists are concerned by elevating the vulnerable and bringing down the powerful. That's absolutely true, but they are coming in at it in very different ways. So I don't know how much we could say they're aligned, but one interesting thing is that the postmodernists like to sometimes draw on the Marxists, while the Marxists don't want to be associated with the postmodernists. I mean, again, think of the Judaism and Christianity things. The Christians can have a lot of respect for Jewish texts. Jews are not going to have much for postmodern, for Christian texts. But when we're within the postmodern ideas, capitalism is one of the boogeymen. So alongside patriarchy, white supremacy, imperialism, ableism, and fat phobia, there is capitalism, and it gets lip service occasionally, but unless it's connected to another form of marginalized identity, it's not given much bandwidth. You don't get a lot of sympathy for straight, white, working class men.
So what do you think is if you think of an ideology or ideas as something that's like living and that can have an end goal, that maybe a person who subscribes to that ideology isn't cognizant of or can't articulate that that's their end goal. What do you think is the end goal of this belief system?
I think they sorry.
Well, because of what you're talking about how they focus on discourse and they focus on controlling the way that we speak and think. And so I have my own ideas about why that is, but I'm curious about why you think that's the focus, and where does it have, maybe there's several different places that this ideology could end up, but where do you think it's heading?
I think if we think of where they're intending it to head, it all gets very confusing, because on the surface, the idea is that we all become aware of the way in which our speech is perpetuating racism, sexism, ableism, etc. And then everybody becomes more careful not to do that. We understand more and more about how we're thinking, and then there's a greater degree of social justice. That is the thinking of it. But in reality, in the practice, we're just, because it is so interpretive and so theoretical, all that is happening is that we're finding evidence of racism in more and more subtle ideas. So saying that you think the best person for a job is the one who should get it is now considered a racist microaggression at some universities. So it doesn't look realistically as though it is going to stop at any time. And one of the and that's something that Robin DiAngelo in particular will say over and over again: nobody is ever done. There is always more to uncover, always more to unpack and to understand. So it's very difficult to say what the end goal was. I've tended in the past to think that the end goal would be that it would disappear ultimately in a sort of clash, in a puff of contradictions, because it doesn't really work. You can't really, I mean, if you look at the contradictions within the activism, we have a problem with modesty constraints on women. We have slut walks because women are judged by their sexuality, and yet we also have support for gender-specific modesty dress when the wearer is Muslim, because this is post-colonialism coming up against feminism, and post-colonial guilt is winning out. And then we've also got a clash quite often in individuals when it comes to critical race theory and LGBT rights, because, and particularly in America, because African Americans are more likely to be religious, there's significant evidence that they're less likely to support LGBT rights than the average white liberal. So trying to cram both of these things together often doesn't work. So I've been hopeful that it would just tear itself apart, but as it's become more and more concrete over the last sort of 10 years, in my book, I look at 3 case studies of this, which are really written very clearly. This is how society works. There are structures of power and privilege. You are racist. It's not possible for you not to be. It's becoming much more totalitarian. And so on the one hand, this is very alarming because young people can understand it. If they're idealistic, as they so often are in universities, they want to fix the world, they can really internalize it. But on the other hand, it's quite a good thing because we can see it now. We can argue with it. We can understand what they're coming. So I think we are moving into the death throes of it. But what worries me is what is going to step into its place. Are we going to are we going to sort of step up to the plate and fix liberalism and reinstate that, or are we going to see the right step in instead? Yeah, are we going to go backwards? Is social conservatism going to have a comeback because of this?
I think that is an amazing, like, fascinating question, because I mean, just seeing it play out with people that I know who like myself have left the ideology. Carter and I have talked about this. I still consider myself a liberal, certainly a social liberal. I'm still trying to figure out libertarianism. Am I not? It doesn't really matter that much to me, but I also know people who have left it and gone way over in this other direction. And we've talked a lot about, well, you know, the whole idea of for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And so I am often afraid that they're creating this authoritarian white identity, this sort of right-wing boogeyman that they want to exist. I wonder sometimes how big that is growing as a backlash to this.
I mean, that's something we've James and Peter and I have argued a lot that one of the main reasons for sorting out social justice and postmodern ideas is because it is encouraging a surge to the right. But we can't measure that. It's obviously not the only reason that the US and the UK now have conservative governments, why there's a rise in populism, in nationalism and anti-intellectualism. I think there's a number of causes for that, but it's certainly not helping. And it's just a thing that we humans do. We seem to think that if some extreme idea is coming at us from one angle, we have to push back with something as extreme. So we're likely to see someone saying men and women are no different at all, it's all socialized, be responded to by men and women are profoundly different and they have natural roles in life. Both of those are equally wrong. But trying to get people to stay in the middle, where the truth is that men and women are overlapping populations with strong trends of differences, but this tells you nothing about any individual, is a losing battle.
I love you, Helen.
I mean, part of the frustration, though, it seems to be that when people don't have the understanding of what you're talking about, like classical liberal values, and they don't understand the difference between universal principles applied liberally and this kind of group tribalism, and they just see society telling them, hey, we're all tribes. This is how we have the tribes organized, and these people are inferior and these people are superior. Do this. They're just going to pick a different description of the inferiority and superiority of those tribes and jump into the tribe that they match. As a result, they're not thinking, they're not really stepping back and thinking about how, hey, we don't actually have to be divided by tribes at all. It's that framework that's a little bit scary to me.
Yeah, and have you seen Nicholas Christakis's book, Blueprint?
No.
The Makings of a Good Society. It's a wonderful book, and it speaks to this.
Is he the professor, just quickly, is he the one from Yale who got yelled at?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. For people who are watching, he was the subject of an SJW kind of mob.
Yes, Erica Christakis, his wife, wrote a letter saying, let's trust students to use their own judgment about Halloween costumes and not police them so heavily. And this was taken very badly as justifying cultural appropriation. And there was a lot of horrible screaming at poor Nicholas in the courtyard of the university, and he eventually left his role as dean there. But he's written a wonderful book on the elements of society, and he's looked at so many different groups which have either voluntarily or involuntarily made their own communities, and what has worked and what hasn't. And so one of the things that he finds human societies do, they kind of, there is this tribalism and there is a mild hierarchy. So we have in-groups and out-groups, and it's not very realistic to imagine that we could ever get rid of them entirely. But there are better and worse ways to act on them. Now, with the growth of liberalism, and this is where Steven Pinker's Better Angels comes in, we're pushed out the circle of empathy. Really about, as further and further, we've started to universalize, to recognize that people who are a different color or a different nationality are still humans like us. We've learned to empathize with them, and this is a development of liberal democracies. And now we're seeing these circles start to close in again because of the polarization that is growing, and that is really much more normal to us. I mean, what worries me is that the kind of social justice postmodern ideas seem to think that reason, evidence, science, universal liberalism, individuality was the default, and they need to deconstruct that, when in fact their way of going on stories and experiences and tribes is the human way that we took a few centuries to mitigate in modernity. Modernity is a really weird and unusual phenomenon, and it has worked so well. And now we're trying to dismantle that. It's now seen as naive to value evidence and reason and science, and
Yeah, you're making me want to quote you to you, but I have to, because it's a beautiful paragraph. I think it's at the end or close to the end of one of your articles. And you're talking about Western values, and you write, sometimes these values are referred to as Western values, although rational, empirical, secular, liberal democracies exist everywhere. Nevertheless, the Enlightenment and the formation of the scientific method in secular, liberal democracies did form and take root in the West. We, the lucky inheritors of them, should not take them for granted and neglect to defend them, not because they're Western, but because they've proven their effectiveness at facilitating the advance of knowledge and the progress of human rights and equality. That, to me, sums up in a nutshell exactly why I feel compelled to fight this ideology. It's because this is an experiment. This Western, we'll say Western, but it's this liberal democracy, this idea of expanding, as you're saying, expanding that empathy circle. This is an experiment, and it's an aberration in for all of human history. It's unusual, and it's very scary to think that this could all be lost, and it's very tempting for a lot of people to collapse back into the tribalism, which is, as you're saying, part of our nature.
Yes, precisely. I think this is something James says a lot. It's the social justice ideas, they get everything backwards. And because we have such a strong sense of reciprocity, that's how our justice works. It's actually the same for most primates. There's a wonderful experiment that Frans de Waal does, trying to pay monkeys unequally. I recommend anyone to search that.
Is this the one where he gives them different grapes for one and something better for the other? Yeah.
Yeah, we have this fairness and this reciprocity, and what social justice are asking us to do now, those of us who are considered privileged, is to suspend that, to allow different rules for other people, to for men to endure sexist insults, for white people to put up with racist insults because of the way they see the systems of power. You can't be sexist to men, you can't be racist to white people, just sit down and take it. That isn't in accordance with human nature. Perhaps some people can be saintly enough to overcome their natural reaction to, right, you're going to be racist to me, I'll be racist to you, but most people won't. What we're much more likely to see, and what I think we are seeing, is a return of traditional gender roles and white identity, which is really very dangerous for the majority identity to start seeing themselves as an identity group. It's unlikely to end well. It's not likely to end well for women if men find themselves being constantly belittled and disparaged either. We see I've seen some genuine misogyny recently.
Yeah. So this brings up the question that we talked about earlier in terms of end goals. Is it too cynical for me to, like, I sometimes cynically think the end goal is hard to identify because it's not a positive one, but it's very easy to identify if I just view it as a negative one, which is just destruction of Western values. Like, everything seems to align only with that. And I don't see anything else, any other end goal that makes sense. But that certainly seems to fit every instance.
Well, it does, because this is, as I keep saying, and people keep doubting me, this is post-modernity. This postmodernism means we are so over modernity. That is what so everything that came up in that time is now seen as a problem. And that's if you call that Western values or secular liberal values, that is what they are challenging most strongly. I think there are still far more people who hold them, and that's why it's often so difficult to argue back with them, because people try to argue with them using reason, using evidence, and using a sense of fairness. Say, well, how would you like it if I said that about you? But they don't understand that this isn't how social justice ideas work. So they're kind of talking past each other all the time.
The people who are just coming into contact with it don't understand it. You're exactly right. And I think that's why it can be easy in these enclosed communities sometimes for for it to take root so quickly, because they're just coming into contact with it for the first time. They're seeing their friends day by day start to convert when there's like this mob stuff happening, and they're basically being asked to accept. It's almost like you said earlier in the episode. Once they've accepted a part of it, they've accepted it in whole. Like once that university started teaching, once Evergreen started teaching these ideas about toxic whiteness, it's like you are now beholden to it. You've accepted it, almost like accepting it as your Lord and personal savior or whatever. But this is now you. I think sometimes people will give in to a part of it without realizing that they've just made themselves beholden to all of it.
Yeah, I think it can creep up like that. From what Catherine was saying to me, it seems like there were a few main sort of ringleaders who had a really strong understanding of how the social justice ideas work, discourse, knowledge, power, and used that. And then a lot of other people have fallen in line. And that seems to be how it works. And I think what we have to do, and it's what my team and I are trying to do, is make the ideas accessible. That's what my book tries to do, break them all down, and then articulate a better alternative. Because the problem is we haven't had to defend secular liberal democracy. It's always been that the people who were the problem were against social justice. So actually trying to use liberal principles to oppose something that's calling itself social justice and progressivism is really very difficult. Nobody wants to feel that they're against social justice, and they also don't have the ability to really articulate what liberalism is. They just say, but this isn't fair, but this isn't reasonable. You just have to treat people as individuals. But we've not grown up having to argue that. It's just been accepted. So now it's difficult for a lot of people to really put into words the problem that they feel and they see, but you can't quite get at it.
Yeah,
that's part of our goal with this show. Is we want to, I consider us doing like the dumbed down version. We're like, but I really want to make it so that people who are just butting up against it, like this guy I met he's some good old Texas boy who is having issues with his kid's school, and it's like an iceberg, and he's just touching the tip of what this ideology is, and he's trying to wrap his head around it. And you are, this is the part where I fangirl out. Like Carter said at the beginning, you have this an amazing mind and an amazing ability to see all the parts of it, at least me looking at you and listening to the way you talk and what you write about. And it's like you can see all the parts of the iceberg, that there's still a lot of the iceberg that's uncovered, that still remains to be uncovered for me. But it's like you're looking at it and you're providing this map. And I'm really grateful for the work that you're doing, because this used to have me in its grips. I was out there like a zombie pushing this on people. During Gamergate, I was on the wrong side. Like, I was on the social justice side, and I know a lot of people who still subscribe to these beliefs, and I know people who are just coming in contact with it, who I think Carter's more concerned with the people who are not already in it, right? Like,
yes,
like we sometimes go back and forth.
Save as many people as Keri. I'm trying to inoculate people.
Yeah, he's like, Keri's trying to save people from it. I'm just trying to inoculate people from entering it. I'm like, okay. Yeah. But anyway, I'm very grateful for the work you're doing, and I'm so excited for your book. When is your book coming out?
Not until the 5th of May, I think. We're going to try and see if we can bring it forward a couple of months, but there's so much to do with getting blurbs and editing and everything. It seems to take a long time. But thank you. I mean, I think I kind of got us lost in the weeds a little while back when we were talking about the Frankfurt School and the Marxism and postmodernism.
Blame me for that. That's my own curiosity that drove us into there, I think. But, something that you just said that I just want to underscore, because I think it's one of the most valuable points that I've heard someone make on this in a while, is this idea that we've been taking Western civilization, well, I don't say Western civilization, I'll say, I don't know what best to call it, like science, reason, the kind of liberal ideas we've taken for granted. And so that's the starting point that everyone has when they're trying to have a discussion about anything. And this is the first time someone's coming along that is not coming from the same starting point. And so we don't know how to defend it. And I love that you pointed out that, I can't believe I hadn't thought of this before, but postmodernism literally means we're over it. Like modernism is what Western civilization is built on. Like it means kind of over the Enlightenment experiment. We're done. With exactly. The Enlightenment. And it's just so hard to even comprehend that anyone would seriously say that after the successes that modernism has bestowed upon humanity, it's almost, maybe people are just incredulous that there could be someone that would seriously argue against modernity.
Yeah, I mean, in our James and I wrote a manifesto against the enemies of modernity, and we were looking both at the pre-modernists and the postmodernists, because they kind of work as a parallel. So the postmodernists will say, yep, this was just a white male masculinist imperialist framework which has been set up to be true for everyone, and it's actually very oppressive. And we need to sort of break things down again and then have small mini narratives for local groups. And then the pre-modernists tend to see modernity, they're kind of right-wing, they're often sort of religious conservatives, or sometimes really, really nuts libertarians who live near Jim, which is how he knows about them.
Like Carter. I'm kidding.
Well, I think you're probably not quite as quite like these ones that message us sometimes, and who say that modernity was generally a bit of a mistake because it took us away from the word of God or from natural law, and put all the...
I'm an atheist, so I'm not likely to make those arguments.
Yeah, but it even happens sometimes with atheists. They've got this idea that expertise itself is suspect, that people know best from their common sense and from what they've learnt from their families and their traditions, even if they're not religious ones. And so they can see reason and science as equally as sort of problematic and constructed as the postmodernists can. We've had people using Hayek's arguments for this, anti-rationalism and anti-science. So I think it's a thing that is natural to humans. We don't trust things that we can't fully understand. We trust things that feel familiar, that feel comfortable, and we tend to catastrophize. So really kind of maintaining this wonderful framework that we have, where we have experts, where we have peer review, where we have systems in which people specialize and gain knowledge in things, and then we use it for all of society, and everybody can argue with it. There's no sacred knowledge. It can all be argued with. It can all be sort of qualified or whatever needs to happen to it. It's really quite counterintuitive to us to do this. If we're left to our own devices, we will retreat into tribes and believe in magic. We will.
So I don't know if you're a parent or not, but getting back to me wanting to inoculate and Keri wanting to rescue people a little bit more. I have one big burning question for you, which is, as a parent or an early educator, what can you do to inoculate the next generation from being susceptible to this kind of ideology?
Well, when they're a bit older, and I'm writing my book essentially for my daughter. She's 15, and I want her to read it before she goes to university. Actually, she has no interest in it, and I think she's inoculated already. But that is what I'm trying to do. But I think as children are growing up, you can talk to them about liberal principles, and you can explain to them how they work. I think that children generally understand this concept of fairness anyway. Even if they're really tiny, you can show them pictures, and you can say things like, look, all these boys are this colour and this boy is a different colour, and now this boy wants to play with this boy. Should he be allowed to? And the child is almost certainly going to say yes. And you've got rid of an illiberal idea, and you can kind of explore these ideas with them if they're tiny. You could say, so do you think this boy's grandparents said this boy's grandparents shouldn't have any rights? Can these boys be friends, or should this boy say sorry to the other one? They're likely to say no, they're friends. They didn't do it. The granddads should apologise. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
Right,
Yes.
You can kind of make stories out of liberal ideas, out of sort of universal fairness of it and individuality that kids can really understand intuitively, and I think that works as a kind of inoculation.
Awesome.
We actually gave some thought, Jim and I, to writing a book like this that parents could use with primary school children, that would have some cartoons like this. What is fair here? What is right?
And do it. Yes, do it.
That was one of the examples we thought of, and it would be, I think getting kids to think that way is would be helpful.
You've used the phrase, I think, universalization, or I've heard you use this phrase of like universal values, and just along the lines of what you're saying, I did find one of the useful things to do with my daughter early on was to just universalize everything. So if she wanted to make a claim about something that was unique to her, I would just say, fine, we can accept that universal principle. Let's see how it applies if we just apply it everywhere. And it was very clear to her. I'd give her examples of how it would apply to her detriment. It became very clear that, actually, it's better to be in a world where we all have the same rules that we're following, right? But yeah, I think I would love to see a book like that. If you guys want to write a book for parents, I concur with Keri.
I will bring that up again with Jim, because I think that would probably be quite a lot of fun for both of us and give our brains a bit of a break. We're trying to get to grips with critical pedagogy at the moment, and it's horrible.
Yeah. Also, I think it's there's something. I mean, it's just you're going to have fun. It's more whimsical. You're writing a kid's book. So, and I think that we try to keep anyway on Deprogrammed or whatever. Try to keep things light sometimes, and keep that sense of humor. And I think it'll be a good switch of gears for you after finishing this first one. Go into the kids' book. Do watercolor.
Well, I'm off next week. I'm going to go and speak to a school. It was one of their 6th year, 18-year-old last year students asked me to come and speak, and the headmaster okayed it. So,
right on.
Nice.
Yeah, so I'm going to try and do a bit more of that. I'm thinking as well of trying to set up some kind of fun so that if student groups invite me, I can, and they can't afford my travel or accommodation if it's a long way away, I can afford to do that. And that would be good. I'd like to kind of mobilize some more student groups, give them some more resources, have them talk to them and have them tell me what's going on and think things through. I think talking to students, I think students are our best bet at the moment.
Yeah, I totally agree. So, look, Helen, any other final final comments you want to make to people who might be watching and I don't know, are confused about social justice ideology and wonder what the hell's going on in the world?
I think mostly just try to be charitable, try to realize that they almost certainly do just want to make the world a better place, but be confident in saying, I don't share your premises, that there is no objective knowledge, or that everything is culturally constructed, or that only certain people can sort about certain things. Be more confident in saying, I'm a liberal, and I want to things should be discussed on the merits of their arguments, not on identity, and things like that.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Really.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
I know we're going to put it in the video, but just remind people where they can follow you online. And I know your book's coming out in May, but if they want to keep abreast of what you're writing about, where can they follow you?
Yeah, Twitter is best, and that's under H Pluckrose.
Great. And like Keri said, we'll put links to everything below. Thank you again, Helen.
And, one thing else, everybody please read Kindly Inquisitors by Jonathan Rauch, and then you will be much better position to argue for liberal values.
That's great advice. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you so much.
Bye, Keri. Bye,
Bye.
Carter.